welcome back to Cities Decoded, where we break down what happens when artificial intelligence meets the nation's cities. I'm, as always, your host, Sam Lee. And today's episode is all about an industry that does affect most major cities, which is the legal profession. This is probably the pinnacle of knowledge work. And a big question as AI continues to develop is how it will disrupt not just knowledge work as a whole, but the legal profession specifically, and what good, if any, can come out of that disruption. So, to help me start answering that question, I'm joined by Justin Curl. He is currently a 3L at Harvard Law School. He was previously a Schwarzman Scholar in China and a Princeton computer science alum. Justin's published two recent pieces that caught my eye on Substack. The first being, let me put this up here. This is like when you put out your first book, we'll also do this type of format. But for now, it is a paper-clipped stack of papers. But this piece is AI won't automatically make legal services cheaper with Sayesh Kapoor and Arvind Narayanan. And the second being AI is just starting to change the legal profession. Justin, welcome to Cities Decoded.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Always love talking about how AI will impact the law. I was telling my roommates before this that I was doing this, and they were like, I wonder what you could possibly be talking about. And so this is great.
Yes, well, I'm very happy you're here. And this is your first Substack Live. And so thank you for doing that with Cities Decoded. That is not underappreciated. And I think before we get into these articles, I'm curious, why choose to go to law school? I'm sure you've gotten this question a lot in the past few years, rather than after graduating your undergrad. Probably right now, I imagine a lot of your peers are cloud coding at big tech companies. So why make that pivot into law?
Yeah, so I did the whole software engineering thing at one point, and I think I quickly realized that the questions that interested me most were how is this technology going to impact sort of society? And I think the legal framework and legal training provides you with a really interesting set of tools to actually shape that technological development for the better. I remember during my software engineering internship, I went to the CEO and I was like, hey, we're putting a lot of people out of work because the product we were doing was for like mortgages, and it made medium skill loan officers less valuable and less needed. So I was like, okay, what are we going to do about all those jobs? He's like, you're a software engineering intern. Why are you thinking about this? Like,
yeah, it's not the scope. It's on your scope. No.
Yeah, I was like out of scope. I was like, okay, well then I'll change my scope and change my skill set such that it can be in scope because that's ultimately the stuff I care the most about.
Yeah, that's awesome. Love that. So let's start as broad as possible. How would you define knowledge work? What does knowledge work mean to you?
Interesting. I think it can be pretty much anything that doesn't really require, this is defining it in the negative, that doesn't really require physical labor. So anything that human beings traditionally have done or anything that you could do with a computer is probably a good indication that something is knowledge work. But I think what makes it particularly hard is it's not always going to be written down and it's not always super clear. Sometimes it'll be just some people know how to do it and it's in the know-how. Sometimes it'll be in your job description. So it very, very broad answer for a very broad question.
Yeah, well, I think that kind of it necessitates a broad answer. Knowledge work can mean many things, but usually it's some sort of analysis, judgment, reading, writing. Basically, a lot of careers that I would say current college students in humanities tracks or pre-law tracks or business tracks are priming themselves to do. And that is, of course, a lot of what you all talk about in both pieces, and starting with how AI won't automatically make legal services cheaper. I really liked in the introduction, the context setting about how AI is currently developing along track with certain legal milestones. You guys mentioned in the intro how researchers identify legal services as especially vulnerable to disruption by AI. GPT-4, it's not even the most advanced model of ChatGPT at this point, passed the bar exam. Law schools have begun incorporating AI into their curricula and partnering with AI-focused legal tech companies to prepare future lawyers for this changing landscape. One lawyer has already argued AI can already replace law clerks in oral argument. Displacement is, of course, a big part of it. And another predicts AI could replace traditional lawyers by 2035. And that all kind of leads to the central claim that you guys put out, where you basically say, hold on, like AI is not just going to one day roll over all of the current legal profession, but in order for AI to usher in a world of abundant legal services, the profession must address a few key bottlenecks, which we'll get more into later, but are regulatory barriers, adversarial dynamics, and human involvement. So I'm curious, again, from your perspective, what does abundant legal services look like for people who are not in the weeds of this, who don't really read the legal profession, what would abundant legal services look like?
Okay, I think this is a fantastic question because I think it highlights an important distinction that I want to make and that I think people often miss, which is I think there's a difference between legal services each hour going down. Like, let's say right now it costs about $250 per hour to get consumer legal services. If that went from $250 to $20, like that is one way to think of, oh, now legal services are more accessible. But one of the points we make in the piece is like there's a difference between outputs, inputs, and outcomes. And so the amount of hours that a lawyer puts in is the inputs. The outputs might be like the number of motions that they wrote or um, the number of like lawsuits they're involved with. But the actual outcome is the thing that clients ultimately care the most about. And so the way that I would define more abundant and accessible legal services is anytime you want a legal outcome, that should be readily available to you, and you should be able to get whatever legal assistance you need to get that outcome.
Right. Yeah. So it's not just about like the legal work becoming more abundant, but it's also making sure that it's accessible and it's helping the most amount of people possible. Yes.
Exactly.
So is that also why you decided to right after jump into why legal services are so expensive? I was reading like the intro, and then when I was getting into the actual meet, I kind of expected you guys to start at bottlenecks, but based on what you just said, it sounds like that probably fed into the rationale for first, like again, just context setting, like why legal services are so expensive, rather than just going straight into the bottlenecks.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's important to do a little bit of context setting for like why this stuff matters, why legal services are expensive, because I also think it frames how we think about the bottlenecks later in the piece. Because if you don't understand that sort of the value of legal services is often relative, or if you don't understand so this like competitive arms race that exists, it's going to be a lot harder to understand the bottlenecks that show up later.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely talk more about it. But you mentioned, or the team mentions, like arms races a lot in this piece, and it it made me laugh because that's usually how I think about like U.S. China or like military, but it's very apt here. So was arms races like already a concept you were using to think about the development before this piece, or did this piece really like hone that in for you? Because now all I think about is like arms races too when we talk when I'm thinking about what you guys wrote.
I think so. Great question. I think part of it might be just be like I've been thinking about U.S. China stuff for a little while now because
Right.
I lived in China for a year, and I think arms race naturally came to mind. But I think what prompted it in this context was I was having a conversation. I like will talk to some of my friends who are litigators right now, and they'll often be like, "Oh my gosh, it's so zero sum. It's so adversarial." I remember reading one of the papers that we cite in the piece. One of the stories is there's a law firm that when the other side asked them for discovery documents to send everything over, rather than print everything on like a normal white piece of
It's
paper,
like foul smelling, like red, really hard to read. Yeah.
yeah, they literally were just like, here are some like awful documents that you can't read that will make you smell. And the story was like the judge actually like would take the documents out of the box and then like sniff it and be like, it doesn't smell that bad. And then he'd be like, okay, this is kind of hard to read, but it's not that hard to read, so it's
Wow.
fine. And that sets like
Wow.
another precedent of how it's not always about like doing better for your client. Sometimes it's or doing better for your side. Sometimes it's about making the other side suffer so that you can get a better result. And I think that's a crazy way to think about it, but arms race felt apt.
Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense. I was wondering if that Schwartzman background was kicking in, and just as somebody who part of my major in college was international relations, and the terms felt familiar when I was reading through it. So good to know. Out of the three structural factors you all lay out for why legal services are so expensive, which are evaluating the quality of the services is difficult, value is often relative, and professional regulations can limit competition from alternative business models. Which, in your opinion, do you think is most pressing to address after doing the research and putting the article out?
I think the most pressing to address is probably the least possible. Like it's the hardest to address, which
Mm,
maybe is because I to me the first one is a really big problem. The fact that we can't assess the quality sort of prevents us from having a functioning market. I feel like with a normal market for goods, you can be like, oh, this is better quality, and it or maybe it's the same quality but it's a lower price. So then you can have like a well functioning market. You can compete and sort of evaluate goods, and so incumbent or upstarts have an easier time of breaking into a field and sort of differentiating on better quality per price. But with legal services, I don't actually see a really good way around doing that. And I think it would probably be a better use of people's time to focus on the regulatory barriers and trying to overcome those because I think we're pretty likely to see some sort of regulatory backlash, which I think would be bad. And we've already started to see some with like there was a recent Judge Rakoff decision finding that your AI communications and your AI chats are not actually privileged. And so to me, this is
Mm,
one ruling that probably right on just in terms of the merits, like you don't really have privilege with an AI chatbot, but that is will function as a type of regulatory barrier that will disincentivize people from going to AI because they know that whatever they upload into it, whatever questions they ask, ultimately that can show up in court. And so
right.
that is a type of barrier that a lot of people on Twitter will call it like rent seeking or yield capture. But
Mm.
I think that is sort of we risk getting into that territory if we don't do something about these regulatory barriers.
When the article gets to the bottlenecks, you guys set the stage with this AI as normal technology framework. And this is originally a framework that is not applied to the legal industry, but then you choose to apply it to the legal industry for the purposes of the article. Could you talk a bit about the framework? And I also have the figure pulled up, so I'll go a little more in depth, but just why this framework? And again, what does it mean for the lay, smart, curious person?
So this framework was first developed by Arvind Narayanan and Sayash Kapoor. I actually worked with them when I was an undergrad, and so I've been like in touch with them over the past few years. And when they released the piece, it sort of went viral, and it's been very popular. And so it operates at sort of one level up in terms of abstraction. It's just saying the basic argument is the thing that matters for AI progress and sort of how we understand AI's impact on society is not the model capabilities, like can Claude do X thing. It is ultimately about diffusion. Like, how are the organizations integrating this stuff into their day to day processes? And to me, this framework is super valuable because it tells you where to focus. It's ultimately like, where should we be focusing our efforts if we want to make sort of AI progress go super well? So that's why I think at a high level, the framework is super valuable. I'm not sure if I've seen Arvind and Sayash say this, but the way I understand the framework is it's supposed to be about it's supposed to be an agency enhancing framework. Oftentimes when you start thinking about AI, you can get into, maybe this is just me, but you can get into these like doomer spirals where you're like, oh my gosh, the future is coming. You're going to end up in like the underclass or like there's nothing we can do about it. But I think
Yeah, it's just you. No one's thinking about that right now. So yeah, it is just you.
well, that's, um, and, um, the, sort of what I think is good about it is it's like, no, actually, there's all sorts of places that we can intervene, and human agency is going to play a very, very important role in sort of making sure that AI goes well. And so, to me, that's like why this framework is so appealing.
Yeah, I agree. And I really appreciated also the first figure that was in the article that just lays out the whole, I think, coverage of what you guys are trying to say. Once Substack Live can do share screen, I will be using that rigorously. But for now, I will just verbally describe it. You and I both know this figure, but to people listening, it's like three columns where it's like state of the world, bottlenecks, and then impact of AI without reform. And then it goes from left to right, where it's like state of the world to bottlenecks to the impact, and then what that impact looks like without reform, and then with reform. And I think that really cleanly sets up the bottlenecks that you guys want to address and why reform is needed to eventually lead into positive transformation of legal services. Um, I'm curious for the with reform parts, how did you guys decide on those? Like state courts, update regulations, creation of regulatory markets, judges make litigation less adversarial. How did you come to that? Because that seems to be the most innovative part here, and we'll talk more about that at the end since you guys talk about the reforms. But I'm curious, like, how did you decide on these reforms? Because those seem to be probably the most important part, but probably also the hardest to execute. Like the bottlenecks, sure, I'm sure they took research, but intuitively, I think you can understand them. But how did you settle on the reforms that you guys ended up settling on?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. I think one thing. So the short answer is we just did like a bunch of reading to think, like looking through what other legal scholars had written about this. Because at the end of the day, like I am a law student. My two co-authors are a CS PhD and a CS professor, and so none of us felt like we really had the authority or just like the background knowledge to be like coming up with our own recommendations. So we were like,
Sure,
okay, let's see what other people have written, and we were shocked by how easy it was to find a bunch of really common sense regulations and or really common sense reform proposals that just weren't getting much traction because sort of for like political economy reasons of just there isn't enough political will. Maybe an idea is languishing in academia and a lot of the decision makers aren't actually like engaging with it. And so we sort of thought we can use AI almost as an opportunity to bring up and like forefront a lot
Mm,
of the reforms that the profession has needed for a long time. Like some of the professions are from like the 1990s or the early 2000s because we've been
sure,
talking about expensive legal services for 3 decades and haven't done much. And so we're like, well,
sure.
maybe AI is the thing that can finally get us going, and we can use this as an opportunity to actually like fix this system, which for many people is fundamentally broken.
Talk a bit more about how specifically you guys are using AI, what models, what prompts are working, how much iteration was going on, because that is, I think, a great use case. So yeah, would love to hear just a bit more there.
In the research process,
Yeah, in the research process for like surfacing that type of content.
yeah, I find it very helpful as just like a research tool. It's a pretty good just like basic research assistant that can find like leading law review articles if you're just like, Claude, here's an argument I'm thinking about making. What have people written that's like similar to that? Prefer academic articles or law review articles from like legal scholars or practitioners or judges. It does a pretty good job of surfacing a bunch of papers, and you just click through and see which ones seem most promising. I do make it a point to like do most of the writing myself because I think
Yeah.
writing is thinking for me. I may not be for everyone, but if I haven't taken the time to actually write it down and distill my thoughts, I don't really know what I'm saying or what I want to say.
Yeah, yeah. I think most people would agree with you on that, or at least I hope people would agree with you on that. So that makes a lot of sense, and that is good to know. Let's dive a bit more into regulatory barriers as the bottleneck. So you start this section off by talking about how more legal assistance would be valuable in, let's say, the context of debt collection. So can you elaborate a bit more about the state of debt collection? Because I think this is something I had no idea about, but again, once I read it, intuitively made a lot of sense why this has become a problem. So yeah, what is the state of debt collection lawsuits in the states?
Yeah, so debt collection lawsuits are sort of exploding right now because it's become technology has made it a lot easier for these sort of large firms to buy up a bunch of debt claims and then use the courts as a way to collect those claims. So if they get a judgment in court, which I think they do about 70 to 80% of the time, based on depending on jurisdiction, they can just garner wages directly from people. So essentially, ra- these like rando third parties are going out, buying a bunch of debt, filing a lawsuit in court through an automated process. And then the judge is like, okay, the person didn't show up to defend themselves. So you win by default. Now you get to just automatically take money out of their paycheck every single month. I think this is actually insane that this is how things function and that so many people are losing by default. So New York, in response, was like, let's create a form that helps people really easily fill this out. There was this nonprofit called Upsolve, which was trained a bunch of volunteers, which are sort of like embedded in these communities. One example of someone that they wanted to train was just like the local pastor who could help the parishioners just um, like fill out these forms. But then the New York AG sued saying that that's unauthorized practice of law. And so
Right.
they weren't able, this is a non AI example, but they weren't able to give any help with filling out this form, which does include complicated questions of like, do you want to invoke the defense of latches? Which, I mean, I barely know what that means. And I've been in law school for 3 years. Um, so I think
And what
there's
does that mean for us who are not in law school?
I actually do forget. I think it's like, do you like they waited too long before bringing this claim, and so it's
Uh,
unjust for them to bring the claim. Um,
sure.
and so it's like a nice defense because it's like, oh well, you sat on your hands, and now you're just like bringing this up at the last minute. I'd sort of moved on with my life. Clearly, it wasn't that big of a deal or that urgent because you never brought it up. But people wouldn't really know what this defense means, and so
Right.
I think it's pretty easy to see how an AI model could really help answer a lot of these questions. But the New York Bar Association has said, and this was a couple, I think this was about a year ago now. So when models were even worse, they were like, oh, these chatbots are starting to look like they're practicing law. And I think the definition of practicing law is super broad. It's, are you taking legal knowledge and applying it to specific facts? And I know a lot of people who will upload a contract into Claude or upload various legal documents and be like, what do you think? Does this look right? Here are my factual circumstances, give me some legal knowledge based on that. And so it starts to look a lot like unauthorized practice of law. These lawsuits sort of crippled LegalZoom back in the day, which was a
Mm,
sort of like software focused provider where they were like, oh, we can use software to really bring down the cost of legal services. They've been sued like a dozen times in like so many different states. They've had to settle in really expensive cases and change how they do business. And so I'm worried that this same pattern will play out with AI if we're not careful. And I feel like we're starting to see some trends of us moving in that direction.
Yeah, let's stick on that for a second. So, New York Bar Association, you wrote about this as well, concerned that the shortcomings of current AI models would harm consumers, has warned that AI-powered chatbots are now hovering at that line of unauthorized practice of law or UPL laws. And while some legal researchers, of course, will disagree because AI isn't a person capable of exercising legal judgment, or because AI systems simply provide information to users similar to paper guides about court procedures. All authors cited in that paragraph agree that the status of AI tools under UPL laws is currently unclear. So, just again, based on your research and where what you're seeing, like where is this going next? Is it sort of an inevitability as AI gets better, where it can practice law in a way, or is this a line that humans are going to hold firm for quite a while?
I think it's really hard to predict because on the one hand, I I think on the one hand, we are likely to see more if LegalZoom is any sort of test case, we are likely to see more lawsuits from people. So the first LegalZoom lawsuit happened when a client paid for services from LegalZoom. The services were great. They were $60. And the client was like, actually, I don't really want to pay for that. And so then sued for unauthorized practice of law and then got their money back. And
Sure.
I could easily because so many different people are able to sue. I wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing some lawsuits with people going after Anthropic or OpenAI, being like, "Oh, you actually provided legal advice," and then um, I think the most compelling arguments that it is fine is that look, this is an AI model is not a person, so it can't be unauthorized practice because only persons can be engaged in unauthorized practice. And then the second is just this is just like a dictionary or like a pamphlet because it's just like giving you information. An LLM is not actually like practicing law. I think if you were to look at some of the chat transcripts, I think a judge would probably disagree and be like, this starts to look a lot like emails between lawyers and their clients.
Yeah.
And then in the long run, though, I really hope I think sort of the reason why we might not see that many lawsuits is because bar associations maybe recognize that we have a big problem with access to justice and the expensiveness of legal services. And they're sort of like AI is inevitable. And because it's
Mm,
inevitable, we're just going to throw up our hands and say nothing we can do about it. And so I think that's
right.
sort of maybe the alternate path. And it just sort of depends on how inevitable people think it might be.
Yeah, I think it gets into a broader discussion of what rights do AI have, and that question or the answer to that question will change like every few weeks given how fast AI is developing. But it makes me think about how Claude has this constitution, or Anthropic has a constitution for Claude, and people are kind of just like, well, what's that really mean? Because first of all, like, there's not a lot of people are going to take time to read that, but then also it's like it kind of feels like a constitution for an AI model is almost like our constitution for the US. But then again, what's the distinction always to like be between being AI and human? So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on just like AI rights in general? We talked a lot about this at like my free speech organization I used to work at, where it's like, does AI have free speech? Like that is a specific example too. But I don't know. Where do you stand with AI having rights, as it were?
So I think so I actually was one of the external like commenters on the Claude's constitution and
Oh,
I
well then, good job. I'm
I
glad at least
I think so just
take
like
that back.
that like conflict disclosed. I think I think Anthropic made a couple interesting choices related to this. I think the first is I was quite surprised by just how much trust they put in Claude. There's one like
Mm,
excerpt or one paragraph on like page 31 where they're like, we our own understanding of morality and ethics is limited. We hope that like
mm,
Claude can see further and farther than we do. And so I think because they're placing so much trust, I think a shocking amount of trust in Claude, the sort of next result is okay, well, if we're trusting Claude, we should probably treat Claude quite well. And I think that's sort of motivated some of the shift towards caring a lot more about model welfare. If you looked at the recent like Opus 4.6 model card, you'll see just like tons of references to being like Claude, if we have like made you contributed to your unhappiness, we're really sorry. Um, and I think Anthropic is starting to go down the route of like maybe we should have AI personhood. I for one don't know exactly where I come out on. I haven't thought about it enough. I think I would lean towards you open up a whole bad can of worms by treating it as a person. Like then it's we don't really like pay for their labor. So then you start to get into some like weird like slavery type considerations. And I just feel like it is a
mm,
can of worms that I don't think people realize is how bad it is going to be if you really want to open it and start being like, okay, AI personhood, AI rights. So
right.
yeah.
Right. That makes sense. Let's shift to human involvement as being a bottleneck. You also bring up the article talks about how an option is incorporating AI into the judicial process to ease the strain on overwhelmed courts. One early report suggests that AI is helping Brazil's courts resolve cases more quickly, with as a specific country example. But if AI advances continuously, reduce filing costs and drive up legal outputs, it will grow increasingly difficult again for judges to keep pace. Perhaps AI will make judges more efficient, but there's a limit to how much AI can accelerate the process without meaningfully sacrificing human involvement. When I read that, that felt very similar to a piece I saw recently about how AI, by virtue of like increasing efficiency and knowledge workers, just makes them more busy, not less. And I guess technically, as a knowledge worker, I can definitely feel that at times where it's like, well, if I just keep automating, if I keep building these agents, it's like that. That is the work that is happening, and then things break, and you're fixing them, which just then leads to the argument that maybe AI should just replace human judges. But of course, there's like legal, technical, and moral objections there. So again, for you, Justin, where are you currently falling on the balance of including AI in court and judicial systems? And maybe like, is there just an inevitability to this as we keep talking about? Like, maybe our opinions don't really matter, but I'm asking you under the pretense that it does. So where do you currently fall on the balance of including AI there?
Yeah, I think so. I had a separate piece about the role of AI in statutory interpretation that came out about a year ago with some co-authors from Princeton and Stanford, and they sort of where we come down is I think AI can be an input to the judicial process, but it should not substitute for the actual decision making. And so what that
Mm,
looks like in say the statutory interpretation context is you can use AI to like find primary sources about the meaning of the word landscaping, which is an actual case that happened. Judge Newsom was wondering whether installing an in-ground trampoline counted as landscaping for the purposes of a insurance contract. And so we think it's okay to like use it to find sources or to sort of like test your intuitions, but you should not use it as an actual replacement for the decision itself. And I am worried that a lot of judges are being like, "Hey, clerk, like, can you just look up and see what ChatGPT would say?" And then it gets an answer, and then it just goes and like plugs that in. So um, I think AI is important to be. It should be used in the judicial process. Can it help? Because it can help make things a lot faster. But I think you have to like very carefully police that it is only an input to the process and does not replace the actual decision making. Um, and then this I think connects to your second point about like this being like, do human beings actually matter in this process? Ultimately, the third bottleneck is a normative one. It is not sort of like a factor of the system. We think it is better where for especially in legal contexts where people are making important decisions about how we want to like be governed as a society and how we want to interact with each other. We think it's super important that those decisions are made by human beings because if we're going to just like turn over everything to AI models, like we have sort of lost as a species that wants to be self-directed and have agency over its future. I don't think we should give that up so easily. And so
right.
it's a normative claim, but I think a fairly compelling one, at least to me. But maybe some people are like, yeah, just let AI do everything. Who knows?
Well, there definitely are, but I'm on your side if that is any
Thank
solace
you. Thank
there. I did want to flag that Mahir in the chat said, speaking of AI rights, would love to hear thoughts on February 10th ruling on AI documents not being subject to attorney-client privilege. So didn't know if you have any thoughts there, but feel free if you do.
Okay, this is very top of mind, Mahir, and I'm sorry that I have not actually read the Judge Rakoff opinion, so I feel like I'm a little bit uninformed on this. I think general impressions from seeing other people talk about it on Twitter are one, I think the conclusion was probably right. I don't think you should get attorney-client privilege for these AI documents. I think some of the like intermediate reasoning steps that got him there were not great. Like I think they were pretty like dismissive of AI and very like hostile towards it, being like, well, obviously it's not a attorney, or obviously it can't do anything related to legal services. So like, why would it be entitled to privilege? It's like, okay, I may agree with your conclusion, but I disagree with the premises that got you there. And so, at the risk of getting out over my skis, I'll stop there. I don't know much more about it.
Well, I'm sure you will know more as that continues to progress. But that makes sense to me. Let's run through the proposed solutions from the
Mhm.
article. You guys talked about institutional reforms, reforming adjudication, the evolving role of lawyers. From those three, where do you want to start? Which one was the most fun or passionate or exciting one to actually write up and put out into the world? Yeah, between those three, where do you want to start?
Can we start? Let's start with the last one, just the evolving role
Uh,
of lawyers, because I think I have the strongest thoughts on it. Um,
okay.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
I was really excited writing the section about being like, we need to hire more judges. We should hire more judges. I think
I
for
think
two
so.
reasons. One is because I don't know, I feel like clerkships are a very competitive part of the law school process. And so I'm just like, yeah, let's get more judges, more clerkships. That's great for people. And I think the other is because it's sort of a reminder, like, yeah, the federal judge system, like the number that we've come up with is sort of just like artificially created. They make up the budget is an insanely small part of the overall budget, and if we wanted to just add more judges, that would probably do a pretty good job of um, like alleviating some of the backlog. And I think it makes sense to me that the ratio of judges to lawyers should be higher in a world where lawyers are not spending as much time completing legal tasks. So yeah.
Yes, and talk a bit more about how the potential problem of increasing the number of specifically federal judgeships could be politically compromised. You all talk about the solution being a bipartisan 2030 commission to depoliticize the process. So yeah, could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the reason it's politicized is because whoever gets to appoint those judges ends up having a disproportionate sway over the future of the judiciary. So, in the most recent Trump administration, he made it a big priority to appoint as many Federalist Society, which tend to be conservative leaning judges, as possible. And so, because like Congress is sort of dysfunctional and sclerotic, and because so then the like main check against the executive is the courts, and so also the Supreme Court hears like 60 to 100 cases a year, whereas the lower courts in like the one level below those appellate courts hear, I think it's like 7,000. So a lot of cases, the final like ruling or decision is being made at the level below. And so if you have a lot more judges on your side, then you could just have like a lot of influence. One maybe counter to this is, oh, well, you just have to like time it properly, where you're just like, okay, you get to a point like 10% of the we ramp up over the next 10 years, and then every year you get to a point like 10%, and you would want to balance it based on like the parties for who's being elected. But yeah, sometimes I have strong feelings about this, but I also worry that it is the most politically naive given the climate we're in. So that's that's not one.
Sure. And then you also talk about switching in-house counsel to be more roles of strategic advisors. And essentially here, it's acknowledging how with AI, like pushing the role of human expertise up the hierarchy, what does that mean for people who are entering and how it's displacing? So talk a bit more about what that shift looks like, at least in your head.
Yeah, I think it's right now lawyers in house spend quite a bit of time like just completing legal tasks. They're like reviewing NDAs, they're reviewing contracts. As AI sort of makes that easier and sort of brings down the cost of completing legal tasks, we think that their role will naturally shift towards being more about business judgment and business acumen, because this is sort of the transactional. So legal services, there's litigation, which is sort of the things you think of when you're in front of a judge, you're arguing in court. Then there's transactional, which is like companies are merging, they're making agreements, they're doing business. The transactional bottleneck, or sort of the transactional equivalent of judges, is I think if I'm a company, I would hope that someone at the company understands the contracts that we're agreeing to, even if they were entirely generated by AI. So imagine like AI can draft the perfect contract. It's like 300 provisions. You probably still want some human being to be like, okay, what does that actually do? How does that affect our interests? How does that connect to our longer term priorities? And so we think this is less a recommendation, more just over time, we think this is what in house counsel will end up doing a lot more.
That flows nicely to your other article about how AI is just starting to change the legal profession. I think through this article, you're answering a key question about, since many legal tasks involve research and writing knowledge work that AI is getting increasingly good at. If AI has so much potential for improving lawyers' productivity in theory, you posit, why haven't we seen it used more widely in practice? And then you go talk to lawyers about it, and you kind of hint that you're more convinced by some reasons than others. So I'm curious which reason was the most convincing for you for why lawyers don't currently use AI as much as they could or should. You mentioned how some of the reasons given are AI doesn't save that much time when the stakes are high. AI adds more value when verifying outputs becomes easier. AI might not help experienced lawyers as much. Many lawyers are unaware of AI use cases and capabilities. And of course, pricing models as well could discourage or encourage AI use. So yeah, what was the most convincing reason out of those
Yeah,
for you?
you give me too much credit by saying I was hinting it. I'm like, yes, I think there are some really bad reasons and there are some very good reasons. Um,
I'm on
I'm
your
gonna start with
side. I'm on your side. Yes.
yeah. The I think the best reason is that AI doesn't actually save you time, because ultimately you hire lawyers because you're like, I want that 99% confidence. Like, I don't want 85% confidence. And so it makes sense to me that lawyers will want to verify very carefully all the stuff that they're coming up with and all the like material that they're producing. And so, um, the that if it takes longer to verify that something is actually correct than you would get by just doing it yourself, then it kind of makes sense that lawyers are not going to want to like write a first draft and then spend all the time just like editing it and reviewing it because that's kind of boring. And so to me, that's a very compelling reason. It's when you factor in the time it takes to verify, you're not actually saving time, so you don't use it. That I think also explains one of the adoption patterns, which is people tend to be using AI for the first draft and the last draft. They use it for the first
Mm,
draft because it's like there's going to be a lot of like middle review in the middle, so it's they're going to be doing a lot of verification anyways, and this is like easier than starting from a blank slate, and it's useful for the last draft because you already have a pretty clear conception of what you want the final output to look like, so it's much easier to like verify what's right and what's wrong. um yeah, so that's better in my mind.
that concept has been true for a year on this podcast. I did an episode almost a year ago with Cameron Powell, who's a lawyer in DC, and he said a very similar thing about AI and first drafts. Don't remember about the last draft, but or final draft, but yeah, first draft is something that I think continues to be a strong use case. So that is something that I think has stuck around more than some other AI developments. So what's least convincing?
I find the like, I don't know how to use AI. I'm busy. Super uncompelling reason. Also, it's not in our business. Like it doesn't align with our business model because a lot of law firms, I think less so these days, but a lot of them use like the billable hour model. I think the main benefit of that is it's useful to have like a unit that you can use to compare lawyers internally against each other. Like if I have a litigation lawyer, an associate, and a transactional associate, and I'm trying to decide who to promote, it's nice to have some sort of like neutral internal accounting way of just like comparing them evenly. And it's also nice to be able
Right.
to justify the high prices that you're charging to clients. Like I think there are reasons for it, but ultimately, I think they're pretty uncompelling given how bad the incentive misalignment is with your client. And I think we should be shifting much more towards outcome focused measures with the caveat that I recognize those are super hard to design. And so I have great sympathy for people who are trying to think up some of them. A few that I've seen that seem quite compelling is on the plaintiff side. There's often greater incentive alignment because they'll take a percentage of winnings, so they only win when the client wins. And then in transactional contexts, I know some law firms are taking percentage of the overall deal value, and they're only getting it if it closes. And so that's maybe a way to do better at aligning incentives. Both of those have their own problems, but again, we should be focusing on outcomes, not outputs.
One last point on this article I wanted to learn more about is you mentioned some of the players entering the legal tech space from Harvey and Deep Judge, which both have AI-powered search tools. They're legal startups that let lawyers sift through documents to find the most relevant ones quickly, to Office and Dragons, which is a bulk processing tool that can update document names, change document contents, run red lines for hundreds of files at once. So like a lot of bulk processing. And you put that in juxtaposition with like established incumbents like Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis, adding AI tools to their platforms. All of those companies I've just said for the first time in my life, so that's been good for me. But it's kind of like a window into what's happening at law schools right now, what some of my friends are going through. So based on your experience, which of these companies are like actually winning in terms of usage, and which ones are like going to stick around for more than their time in the sun? I'm curious. Since I'm so not in that world, like what are people actually using that's turning out good outcomes there?
So I think it's really hard to predict because a lot of these companies are very, very like confidential and they keep it very tight how many like users they have, what their revenue is. Like a lot of that's not
Sure.
publicly available. Also, one thing that is interesting is unlike sort of the most like cutting edge language models, which sort of they want as many people as possible to be using it. Um, Harvey doesn't offer like a free version to law students, nor does like Legora.
Mm.
Um, I think maybe if you have a partnership, there might be some way to get it, but at least for me, I have not been. No one has offered me Harvey, um, and I think part of that is because I think where a lot of the value is right now is actually in doing the work for the lawyers of coming up with use cases so they don't have to. Like you're designing workflows that lawyers can
Mm.
easily integrate and easily figure out, um, and so they're yeah, they're like coming up with all this stuff. And so if you just like make that available to everyone, you're essentially giving away the main like competitive advantage you have, which I think is part of the explanation for why it's not like super widely shared.
Fair. Are you ready to close out with a rapid fire lightning round?
Yes, I would love to.
Great. Let's do it. So, what part of your Princeton CS background still shows up in how you think about legal problems nowadays?
Oh, interesting. Uh, I think it's helped me. I have like I have a tendency to there's a law professor says there's clumpers and there's chunkers. Clumpers take everything and then they're like, oh, they take a bunch of parts. They're like, this is actually part of the same thing. Chunkers are like, let's always break things up and analyze it and make it more modular. And I think I'm very much a chunker, and that's a result of my
Mm.
coding background where I'm always like, okay, how can I modularize this? How can I like create the least unit, the best unit of abstraction for thinking about this problem? And I find that often is helpful in law.
What's a boring part of the legal system, or I guess one that most people would consider boring that you are obsessed with and passionate about?
Um, oh,
If
oh,
anything, maybe you're not.
there might not be any I like, I think there's so much potential to imagine what law can be, but I think a lot of people maybe it's like I think a lot of people would want to spend more time thinking about what law can be and how it can be used for good, but maybe we just don't have enough time to, like, do that properly. But I spend most of my time thinking about that, which is nice.
Sure. I think that's a very good use of time, by the way. I think many people can benefit from that. So keep doing that. Is there any legal task you personally think AI will never do better than humans, or will never do as best in the human interest of humans as we can do, even if models get, infinitely better?
Ooh, I probably won't say never, so I'm sure that I can't think of anything that's, like, truly impossible.
What is the biggest misunderstanding people have about law that you wish they didn't?
I think people think it's a lot clearer than it is. I think the law is like very murky and very hard to understand. It's a lot of standards of like, is this? I think it's what's frustrating is if you ask for legal advice, the most correct and most common answer you will get is it depends. Super
Yeah.
annoying, but that's just like how it is. And so if you're asking like, oh, like OpenAI did this thing, is that illegal? It's like, well, it depends on like that what exactly they did, how it's framed, what did the judge think, what did the jury think. Like it is not bright line rules, it's like mushy, flexible standards most of the time, especially for the things we care most about.
Now, answer that same question on misunderstanding, but at school after law. So, biggest misunderstanding about law school that you wish people didn't have that annoys you.
Um, I think people don't realize coming in the high percentage of people that leave and go into corporate big law. I think if you
Mm.
it is useful, like, I think people should think carefully about whether they're, like, the exception to the rule or they're part of the rule. Because like, 90% of people from, Harvard go into big law after graduation, which I think is a very high number.
Yes, yes. That is my sister, so that I can vouch for that.
Sorry to
Yeah.
associate
So
it.
yeah. And I think she's here right now. So hi, sis. What's
Sorry.
a belief? No, I think she's doing well. I think so. What's a belief you've had about and the law a year ago that you've changed your mind on? Something that you no longer believe in?
Interesting. So I think the honest answer is I wasn't thinking about AI in the law a year ago, and most of my
Fair.
thinking has been in the past year. Um, I think, actually, the easiest is like model capabilities have convinced me that this is going to be much more useful than I thought it would be. Like if you asked me a year ago and I tried to use some of the AI tools, I'd be like making up citations, not very good. But in the past year, I've now been like it pretty much just never hallucinates. I'm obviously going to check it, but it's so good.
If you can predict what's an opinion in 1 year you think you'll have that you currently don't, if you're thinking about it that way, I'm curious if you have an answer there. It's okay if you don't. If that, yeah, it's like you're
I
predicting the future.
I I'm very so I'll just say like the area that I'm the most uncertain about and which I think could be the like highest um so like the greatest likelihood of me believing something I don't currently believe because I'm so uncertain about it is I don't have a good sense of the relative speed of sort of um like how much sort of in the arms race, sort of bottleneck two, there's on the one hand, you increase the amount of work, which offsets the productivity gains versus the rate of productivity gains. And so I don't have a good sense of which one's actually going to end up being faster because I could see a world where like, no, AI is actually so good that it makes you so productive that it doesn't matter how much more work is created because if you're spending 10 seconds versus 20 seconds, it's still negligible. So I don't have a good sense of that. And I could see myself being really easily convinced one way or the other.
Yeah. I think in my line of work, which is also knowledge work, but also figuring out what media is looking like and content's looking like as AI develops, I feel like right now the gap between somebody smart who's keeping up with AI and then somebody smart who's keeping up with AI like 5% less isn't that crazy. But I think in a year, even that 5% differential will mean a lot because the developments are just happening at such a fast pace. So what I'm thinking about is how do you catch that second wave of people who just didn't have time that day to read the viral X essay or didn't have time that week to understand like what Anthropic ads mean in the Super Bowl and why it's a big deal the way they're targeting OpenAI.
Hmm.
And I think catching that second wave will be very important because those are so very like smart, engaged, intellectually curious people who span law, tech, and all the other relevant sectors as well. But they just didn't have time at that moment, nor maybe they don't want to be on X, which is very fair. And that is something that I feel like I hope I'm wrong, but I get the sense that those differentials are becoming smaller and smaller. Like if you miss a news piece in a day or in a week and you don't have a reliable way to catch up on it in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming or overstimulating, um, yeah, we're in trouble. Like the less people are informed that who should be informed. So that's something that I'm thinking about as well.
How do you
Which
think about like the like the Lindy effect where because I feel like chasing so the Lindy effect is just like the longer something has existed, the longer it will exist into the future, just because
hmm,
it's like timeless, and so like that's sort of why people are going back to the classics. I
right.
wonder. I feel like chasing trends is a very this is something my advisor told me, or Arvind actually told me. He was like, "Don't chase trends. It's very like it's like painful and it like often isn't going to work out. Like just do things that you think are is like important and likely to stand the test of time." Um,
Yeah. Don't
I'm
tell
wondering how
snake
you,
oil, right?
yes, yes. He's I think AI snake oil is a provocative title to a thesis that is still true, but yes, that is one of his books.
Yeah. Finish your thought though. If
Yeah, I'm just
that
wondering
was
how you're thinking about like the balance between wanting to catch people up with like the latest thing versus like no, I want them to like I don't care whether they read the latest X essay. I want them to have a deeper understanding of like how to engage with it so that if it comes up, they can like reason from first principles.
Well, I think to the point of things being timeless, like there are certain things about human nature that will not change with AI. Like there is still a human desire to understand what's happening, most importantly, how it's affecting yourself, but then also your family, your loved ones, your communities. And then that is why I think in tech, but I think it's just going to spread out into other industries. Like there's this really rapid rise in community building and community involvement. I feel like the whole point of me being a full-time community manager is to help with that. So
Hmm.
I think the way I'm thinking about not chasing trend is understanding like what humans will just want to care about. And I think most people do not care about the latest Claude model or OpenAI model. What they care about is if that's going to displace their job and or even if not displace their job, how to augment it. I think it's really unhelpful for people to kind of talk down in a way to other smart people who might not be as technically minded or as tech focused to be like, yeah, like, you're probably going to lose your job or some other life altering effect. Even if it ends up being true, I just don't think that is the best way to go about it. But
Hmm.
instead, I think what we're going to see regardless is that humans crave community. Introvert, extrovert doesn't really matter. I think that people want to figure out not only what they're feeling about something, but if they can like fact check with people who they trust, with their friends or other smart people. And I think that is generally where resources should be going towards, not just like the physical spaces, but also that's why with Substack, like I want to do more roundtables and Justin contributed last time where it's not just one person's perspective and then maybe like one person's opposing perspective, but rather like what is a kaleidoscopic view? Because that is your virtual living room. That is you being in the room with people who will help you think better about an issue and think deeply. And then you can also move on because there's a lot of life to live outside of your work and AI and screens and all of that. So that's kind of what I'm chasing, where like, yes, there will always be a new model. Um, I only see the development of AI continuing to grow, but there are certain fundamentals to how humans like to process and communicate and grow with each other that you literally cannot ignore. And I think that is what, at my best, I can help in a very small way contribute to. Yeah,
Yeah, I love that.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, Justin, for being on Cities Decoded. And if you're listening on Substack, please consider recommending us. We are also on all major podcast platforms. Um, be ready to see more roundtables, more live streams, and other fun announcements later this week for Cities Decoded. I learned a lot. This is probably the closest I will get to law school. So thank you, Justin, for that, because I don't think law school is in my future as a clear choice.
Mhm.
So thank you for the work. I hope it continues to get the attention it deserves. Excited to read more of your stuff. And I'm sure you'll be back at some point. So I look forward to that. But in the meantime, thank you again. And this is great. I had a great time and learned so much. So thank you for that.
This was so fun. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I had a blast.
Awesome. All right. Talk later. Bye, everyone. Take care.